In the heart of the 19th century, a young woman stepped onto the throne of Britain and forever changed the course of history. Her name was Victoria, and her reign would come to define an entire era. When she became queen at just 18 years old, no one could have predicted that she would preside over one of the most transformative periods the world had ever seen. From breathtaking industrial progress to the rise of a vast empire, from family dramas to political rivalries. The story of Queen Victoria is one of resilience, determination, and extraordinary influence. But who was she really? Behind the crown, behind the portraits and the public ceremonies, there was a woman with hopes, fears, passions, and struggles. A queen who loved deeply, grieved profoundly, and yet managed to become the enduring symbol of stability during decades of change. This is not just a history lesson, it's a journey into the life of a figure whose impact can still be felt today. Imagine a time when trains were first roaring across the countryside, when photography was capturing moments for the very first time, and when the telegraph was shrinking the world into something faster and more connected. So all of this unfolded during Victoria's reign. She witnessed invention, revolution, expansion, and reform, and through it all, she became a beacon of continuity for her people. Her story is not just about royal titles or grand palaces. It's about love, her powerful bond with Prince Albert, her heartbreak after his untimely death, and the way she carried that sorrow for the rest of her life. It's about power, her complex relationships with prime ministers, her influence over politics, and her ability to adapt to the demands of a rapidly changing nation. And it's about legacy, the family she raised, whose marriages tied her bloodline to nearly every royal house in Europe, earning her the title Grandmother of Europe. As we dive deeper into her journey, we'll uncover the triumphs and the trials, the public image and the private reality. We'll see how Victoria's reign shaped modern Britain and left an indelible mark on the world. Whether you're fascinated by history, intrigued by the drama of royal life, or simply love a good story, this is a tale that has something for everyone. Before we begin, a quick reminder. If you enjoy stories like this, rich with history, emotion, and a touch of mystery, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. That way, you won't miss any of our upcoming episodes as we continue to explore the most captivating lives and events from the past. Your support means the world, and it helps us keep bringing these incredible stories to life. So, settle in, relax, and let us step back in time to the world of Queen Victoria, the young girl who became a queen, the queen who became an icon, and the woman whose era still bears her name. It was in the year 1837, at a moment when Britain was poised between the traditions, the past, and the rapid transformations of the future, that a young woman scarcely out of her teenage years ascended to the throne, and with that singular event began a reign so enduring, so deeply intertwined with the heartbeat of an empire, that it would stretch across more than 6 decades and become the longest in British history at that time, lasting until the very first year of the new century in 1901. From the instant Victoria placed the crown upon her head, she became more than a monarch. She became the embodiment of an age, a living symbol of continuity in a world being reshaped by the thunder of machines, the expansion of railways, the spread of new ideas, and the steady march of social reform. Her reign was not simply a matter of years counted in royal calendars. It was a vast expanse of time that saw the rise of industry, the flowering of literature and science, the widening of democracy through reform acts, and the transformation of Britain into a global power that stretched its influence across continents, oceans, and cultures. To reign from 1837 to 1901 was to witness an entire world in motion. A world where discoveries like the telegraph and photography altered the way human beings communicated and remembered. Where the might of the British Navy projected authority far beyond the Isles, where the challenges of poverty, labor, unrest, and political change tested the resilience of a nation. For Victoria herself, those 64 years were not merely a chapter of public duty, but a profoundly human journey, marked by youthful uncertainty as she first sought to understand the enormity of her role, by the tender companionship she found in her marriage to Prince Albert, by the devastating loss that came with his death, and by the long shadow of grief that nevertheless did not prevent her from continuing to serve as a steadfast figure at the center of a rapidly changing society. Her longevity on the throne meant that entire generations were born, grew to adulthood, and even passed away, having known no other sovereign. And for millions of her subjects, she became a constant presence, a familiar face whose endurance mirrored the endurance of the empire itself. To speak of Queen Victoria's reign is to speak of a span of time so rich in change that it seems less like the reign of a single woman and more like the life story of a nation itself, unfolding across the 19th century with all its contradictions of progress and struggle, innovation and conservatism, grandeur and hardship. Her rule was not a static relic, but a living, breathing narrative that carried Britain from the world of candlelit parlors and horse-drawn coaches into the dawn of electricity and international telegraphs, from the old rhythms of rural tradition into the restless pace of industrial modernity. And through it all, she remained the figure at the center of the stage, as a queen whose personal life and public duty became inseparably woven into the very fabric of history. The years that unfolded beneath Victoria's crown would eventually come to bear her very name. For historians and ordinary people alike could find no title more fitting than the Victorian era to capture the sheer breadth of transformation that swept across Britain and far beyond its shores, a time when political landscapes were redrawn through reforms that slowly widened the right to vote and reshaped the balance of power between crown and parliament. When industrial progress surged forward with a relentless energy that filled the skies with the smoke of factories, powered great ships across oceans, and laid down the steel tracks of railways that stitched together distant corners of the land, and when cultural life bloomed with such vigor that writers, poets, and scientists created works whose echoes still resonate in classrooms and libraries today. To live within this era was to stand at the crossroads of tradition and innovation, to watch as age-old customs persisted in drawing rooms and churches, while at the same time inventions like the telegraph, the photograph, and eventually even electric light illuminated the dawn of a new age, giving people an awareness that they were participants in something larger than themselves, something vast, modern, and unstoppable. It was a period in which the empire grew to encompass territories and peoples scattered across the globe, not only extending Britain's reach, but also knitting together a web of cultural exchanges, tensions, and complexities that made the 19th century a stage of unprecedented global interaction within the borders of the nation. The Victorian era was marked by a sense of moral seriousness and social responsibility, ideals that were both celebrated and debated, inspiring movements for education, for the rights of workers, and for charitable efforts aimed at addressing the hardships born from rapid industrialization. Literature from this time, whether in the haunting novels of Charles Dickens that exposed the struggles of the poor, or in the poetic reflections of Alfred Tennyson that gave voice to grief and hope, mirrored the contradictions of a society both proud of its progress and troubled by its inequalities. Science, too, leaped forward with boldness as the theories of Charles Darwin challenged traditional understandings of life itself and sparked debates that reached far beyond laboratories and lecture halls. To call this the Victorian era, then, is to recognize that it was not merely a reign measured in years or decades, but rather a living tapestry of change, woven from the threads of politics, industry, and culture, each strand pulling and shaping the others, until the fabric of society itself took on a new form. Under Victoria's watchful gaze, Britain was no longer the same country that had crowned her in 1837. By the time the century turned and her reign came to its end, the nation had been remade into a modern power, its identity forever tied to the Queen, whose name now stands as a shorthand for the extraordinary age over which she presided. At a time when the empire was already vast and the weight of tradition pressed heavily upon the crown. Fate placed its hand upon a young woman who had scarcely crossed the threshold into adulthood. For when King William IV passed away in the summer of 1837, the line of succession carried its gaze not to a seasoned statesman or an experienced royal, but to his 18-year-old niece, Victoria, a girl who had been raised in relative seclusion under the watchful eyes of her mother and advisors, and who now found herself summoned to assume a role of almost unimaginable magnitude. The transition was sudden, the responsibility enormous, and yet, from the very first day of her reign, she displayed a composure that astonished those who had doubted whether someone so young could carry the burden of sovereignty, sitting firmly upon the throne with a dignity and seriousness that signaled to ministers, courtiers, and subjects alike that she was determined not to be a mere figurehead, but a monarch in her own right. Her youth, far from being a weakness, gave her reign an energy and freshness that the nation had not felt for some time, as the elderly king who had preceded her had been regarded more as a caretaker than a visionary, whereas Victoria embodied a new beginning, a symbol of vitality at the very moment. Britain was stepping into a century of innovation and reform. Those first audiences with her ministers revealed a quick intelligence and a firm resolve, for although she had been shielded from the intrigues of politics, during her upbringing she possessed a natural curiosity and a sharp memory that allowed her to grasp the complexities of governance with remarkable speed. Yet, behind the public image of confidence, there was also the private reality of a young woman adjusting to the isolation that accompanied royal duty, separated from the ordinary experiences of youth and learning to navigate a world where every gesture, every word, every choice was subject to scrutiny. In that pivotal year of 1837, when Europe still bore the echoes of past revolutions, and Britain stood at the threshold of profound change, the accession of an 18-year-old queen seemed both daring and uncertain, and yet it was precisely this mixture of fragility and determination, of youth and responsibility, that gave Victoria her distinctive presence. She was at once a daughter, a niece, a young woman barely tested by life, and now the sovereign of a kingdom that was stretching its influence across continents. And the contrast between her tender age and her immense duty created a sense of drama that captivated her subjects, who found in her both a monarch to respect and a figure whose humanity they could recognize. From this unlikely beginning, the long arc of her reign would unfold, carrying with it all the triumphs, struggles, and transformations that would make her not only the ruler of her people, but the very emblem of an age. It was not long after her coronation that the young queen's life was altered yet again by the arrival of a man whose presence would shape not only her private happiness, but also the course of her reign. For in 1840, Victoria entered into marriage with her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a union that was as much a story of personal devotion as it was a carefully considered dynastic alliance, though some courtiers and politicians viewed the match with suspicion, wary of foreign influence upon the British throne. Victoria herself had no such hesitation, for from the moment she first met Albert, she felt a connection that transcended the stiff formalities of royal life, a warmth and vitality in his character that drew her closer with each encounter, until it became clear to her that her future could not be imagined without him at her side. What made this marriage extraordinary was not simply the pomp and ceremony of a royal wedding, though the occasion itself was celebrated with all the grandeur befitting a queen, but the depth of the partnership that followed. For Albert was not content to be merely a consort in name and Victoria, despite the weight of tradition. Cania and the expectations of court welcomed him as a true companion in governance and in life. Their relationship blossomed into one of remarkable balance, with Victoria's forceful personality tempered by Albert's patience and intellectual rigor, while his bold ideas for reform and progress found support in her position as sovereign. Theirs was a bond marked by genuine affection, expressed in letters that revealed tenderness and longing. In shared moments of joy, when children were born into their household, and in the mutual respect that allowed them to act as partners rather than rivals in the difficult world of monarchy. For Victoria, the marriage was also a liberation from the constraints that had marked her youth. The overbearing control of her mother and advisors, replaced by the comfort of a husband who treated her not as a child to be managed, but as an equal to be cherished. In Albert, she found someone who could bear the weight of responsibility alongside her, whose steady presence calmed her impetuous nature, and whose vision of education, science, and industry helped to shape the character of the era itself. Together, they cultivated a domestic ideal that would come to symbolize Victorian values, presenting themselves not only as monarch and consort, but as a devoted couple, their family life serving as a model that many of their subjects admired and even sought to emulate. The early years of their marriage were filled with a sense of promise, with Victoria delighting in her new role as wife, while also continuing to assert her authority as queen, and Albert embracing his duties with seriousness and energy, proving himself far more than a decorative figure by engaging deeply in matters of policy, culture, and social improvement. Their union, rooted in both love and shared ambition, became one of the most defining aspects of her reign. For the story of Victoria cannot be told without the story of Albert. His influence would leave an indelible mark on the monarch, the empire, and the age that came to bear her name. From the very beginning, the union between Victoria and Albert unfolded not only as a political alliance or a ceremonial duty, but as a genuine love story that grew richer with time. And one of the most tangible results of their deep affection for one another was the large family they built together. For over the course of 17 years, they welcomed 9 children into the world, each new arrival celebrated with a mixture of joy, relief, in the sense that their household was becoming not just a royal residence, but a living sample of the domestic ideal they so carefully cultivated. The Queen, despite her occasional anxieties about pregnancy and childbirth, always found herself drawn into the warmth of motherhood, holding each infant in her arms with a mix of awe and vulnerability, while Albert, attentive and gentle, took an active role in the upbringing of their children, ensuring that they were not only heirs to titles and lands, but also young people grounded in discipline, learning, and a sense of duty. As the years passed, their family became a symbol of stability in an age of rapid change, the palace ringing with the laughter of children who would later grow into figures of immense significance across Europe. For the marriages of Victoria and Albert's offspring wove a complex web of alliances that stretched across the continent. Daughters and sons were married into the ruling houses of Germany, Russia, Denmark, and Spain. And through these unions, the Queen became known as the grandmother of Europe, her descendants seated upon nearly every major throne of the era, shaping the politics and destiny of nations in ways both overt and subtle. Yet, behind the grandeur of these dynastic ties, there remained the simple truth of a family that enjoyed gathering together around fires, celebrating Christmas with decorated trees and music, and writing affectionate letters to one another, even when distance and duty pulled them apart. The presence of 9 children also revealed the dual nature of Victoria's private and public life, for though she often spoke candidly about the challenges and discomforts of repeated pregnancies, she could not deny the profound sense of purpose she felt in seeing her family grow, nor the pride she took in watching her children mature and take on roles of their own. For Albert, the children represented the hope of carrying forward his ideals of education, morality, and civic responsibility, and he worked tirelessly to instill in them a respect for knowledge, culture, and service. Together, Victoria and Albert fashioned a household that combined the traditions of monarchy with the intimacy of family life, demonstrating that even within the walls of palaces, love, laughter, and the bonds of kinship were as essential as crowns and scepters. In time, this vast family would become both a blessing and a burden. For, while their marriages bound nations together, they also meant that the personal joys and sorrows of the queen stretched far beyond Britain's borders, her heart tied to distant courts and foreign conflicts through the lives of her children. Still, in the decades when Albert lived by her side, the image of Victoria surrounded by her children captured the imagination of her subjects, reinforcing her role not only as a monarch but also as a mother, a figure whose family life seemed to mirror the values of loyalty, devotion, and unity that many Victorians aspired to uphold in their own homes. What gave Victoria's reign its unique texture was not only the image of a queen surrounded by her ever-growing family, but also the steady and profound presence of Albert, who was far more than a devoted husband and father, for he quickly emerged as one of her most trusted confidants and advisors, shaping her decisions and leaving his imprint on nearly every sphere of political, cultural, and intellectual life during those crucial decades. Unlike many consorts who faded into ceremonial obscurity, Albert approached his role with a seriousness and a sense of duty that impressed even those who had initially doubted him. And though he held no official political office, his influence was felt everywhere, from the corridors of power in Parliament to the design of institutions that would carry Britain forward, into the modern age, to the quieter rhythms of cultural refinement that blossomed under his guidance. Albert was deeply committed to the idea that a monarchy could not survive by relying solely on tradition or grandeur. Instead, it needed to embody progress, moral responsibility, and engagement with the great currents of change sweeping across the 19th century. To that end, he encouraged Victoria to embrace a vision of monarchy that was less aloof and more attuned to the needs of her people, guiding her through moments when her instincts clashed with political reality, tempering her strong will with reasoned counsel, and often drafting memoranda and speeches that reflected his own passion for reform and innovation. He became a champion of science, education, and the arts, tirelessly promoting initiatives that would expand knowledge and cultivate civic pride, with the most dazzling example of his vision being the Great Exhibition of 1851, a monumental display of industrial achievement and artistic creativity that gathered wonders from across the world. Beneath the glittering glass vault of the Crystal Palace, through Albert's influence, the monarchy began to redefine itself, no longer standing apart as a relic of the past, but positioning itself as a guiding symbol of national progress. And this transformation was not lost on the British public, who increasingly saw in Victoria and Albert a model of leadership that combined tradition with forward-thinking ideals. Yet Albert's contributions were not limited to grand projects or public spectacles. In countless private moments, he counseled Victoria with a clarity and steadiness that provided her with confidence in times of uncertainty, urging her to rise above the pettiness of political rivalries and to think of the broader needs of the empire she governed. His partnership gave her reign a balance it might otherwise have lacked, for his intellectual rigor and visionary outlook complemented her natural determination and sense of duty, together creating a dynamic that helped Britain navigate the tumultuous shifts of industrialization, social reform, and expanding global influence. In Albert's quiet strength, Victoria found not only a source of personal comfort, but also a wellspring of ideas and inspiration that shaped the very character of the Victorian era. Making their marriage more than a personal love story became a collaboration that influenced the destiny of a nation, leaving behind an enduring legacy that can still be traced in Britain's institutions, its cultural life, and sense of identity today. When fate dealt its cruelest blow in December of 1861, the world that Victoria had so carefully built around her beloved husband shattered in an instant. For Albert's sudden death from illness not only deprived her of the man she had relied upon in both private affection and public duty, but also left her adrift in a sea of grief so consuming that it seemed to swallow her very identity as queen and woman alike. In the days that followed, the once vibrant halls of Windsor and Osborne fell into a heavy silence, as if echoing the emptiness in her heart, and Victoria, overwhelmed by sorrow, withdrew from the glittering world of state affairs, choosing instead to retreat into seclusion where the memory of Albert remained her constant companion. Her mourning was no passing phase, no brief observance of convention, but a lifelong testament to the depth of her love and the permanence of her loss. And from that moment until her own final breath, decades later, she would clothe herself only in black, turning her very appearance into a symbol of undying devotion and perpetual sorrow. Courtiers and ministers often despaired, for the Queen's withdrawal from public life seemed at times to weaken the monarchy's visibility. Yet, for Victoria, there was no question of returning to the gaiety and ceremony that had once defined royal life. Her existence became instead a vigil of memory, in which every portrait, every letter, every carefully preserved belonging of Albert's kept him alive in her presence. But her grief, though deeply personal, also carried political and cultural reverberations, for the image of a queen cloaked in mourning touched the hearts of her subjects, who came to see in her not only a distant sovereign, but also a woman who suffered, who loved, and who endured as they themselves did in times of loss. Monuments to Albert began to rise across Britain, from the Grand Albert Memorial in Kensington Gardens to institutions of learning and art that bore his name, showing that his vision and memory were woven into the very fabric of Victorian society. And while critics grumbled about her long retreats from ceremonial duties, many found in her unwavering fidelity to Albert's memory a kind of moral steadfastness, a reflection of values that resonated in an age that prized loyalty, family, and devotion. Thus, the second half of Victoria's reign was colored by the shadow of mourning. Yet, within that shadow, she fashioned a new role for herself, one that emphasized not glittering spectacle, but solemn endurance, transforming her image into that of a widow queen who carried the weight of empire while never ceasing to carry also the burden of her own grief. In that blend of sorrow and strength, Victoria's story took on a poignancy that no act of statecraft alone could have achieved, for her personal loss became entwined with the collective imagination of her people, binding monarch and nation together through the shared language of remembrance and resilience. For a time after Albert's death, the Queen's world contracted into a cocoon of sorrow, so dense that it seemed the bright pulse of public life, the ceremonies, the audiences, the meetings of Parliament, even the bustle of London itself might never penetrate the fortress she had built around herself. And in those years of self-imposed exile from the limelight, Victoria allowed her grief to define not only her daily existence, but the very rhythm of the monarchy, retreating to Windsor, Osborne, and Balmoral, where the memories of her beloved husband were everywhere present, from the carefully preserved letters and keepsakes to the quiet spaces where she had once shared laughter and counsel with him. Yet, even within this withdrawal, life continued to unfold around her, the machinery of empire pressing onward, ministers requiring guidance, and her people watching with a mixture of empathy and concern. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the Queen began to feel the stirrings of a sense of duty that would eventually draw her back from seclusion. Her return to active public life was not sudden or ceremonial. It was a slow, deliberate re-engagement in which the rhythms of responsibility eased her out of mourning without diminishing it, allowing her to balance the private ache of loss with the demands of sovereignty. Audiences were resumed, speeches delivered, and official visits, undertaken, each carefully managed to maintain dignity and solemnity, while signaling to the nation that the Queen, though still deeply marked by grief, remained committed to her role as the living symbol of the empire. This period revealed a transformation in Victoria's character. The same woman who had been animated by youthful vigor now carried herself with a measured composure, a quiet authority that commanded respect without the need for flamboyance. And it was this blend of resilience and sensitivity that gradually restored her presence in the eyes of her people. At the same time, Victoria's careful re-engagement served as a model for the monarchy itself, demonstrating that personal suffering need not translate into abdication of duty, and that the crown could embody both human vulnerability and steadfast governance. She maintained her mourning attire, black garments marking her devotion to Albert, Yet her actions conveyed a message of enduring commitment to her nation. She attended ceremonies, presided over state functions, and took an active hand in political and social matters, often consulting with ministers and lending her influence to projects and initiatives that reflected both her and Albert's shared vision for the kingdom. In these years, her reputation shifted from that of a grieving widow to that of a seasoned and respected sovereign, whose life and example illustrated the possibility of combining personal loyalty with public responsibility, a lesson that would resonate across generations. Through this gradual return, Victoria not only reclaimed her place at the center of the empire she ruled, but also demonstrated the subtle power of resilience, showing that even in the aftermath of profound personal loss, one could emerge to fulfill obligations, guide a nation, came to continue to shape the cultural and political life of an era, leaving behind a legacy that was as much about character and endurance as it was about crown and country. As the decades rolled on and the 19th century surged forward with a momentum that reshaped every corner of British life, from the smoke-filled skylines of industrial cities to the bustling markets of small towns, from the clatter of new railways connecting distant regions to the hum of telegraphs carrying messages across continents, Victoria came to be perceived not merely as a monarch who occupied a throne, but as a steadfast emblem of stability and morality in an age that seemed constantly poised on the edge of upheaval. For her very presence offered a reassuring constancy to a society navigating the dizzying pace of technological innovation, social reform, and imperial expansion, and in her carefully measured public demeanor, the people found a reflection of order, discipline, and enduring values that contrasted with the unpredictable currents of change swirling around them. In a time when factories belched smoke that darkened the skies, when steamships and railways were transforming commerce and travel, when new ideas in science, philosophy, and politics challenged old assumptions, Victoria's steady figure clad in the solemn black of her mourning, or later in stately ceremonial robes, came to symbolize a moral compass that both guided and comforted, a reminder that amidst innovation and uncertainty, there remained an anchor of duty, propriety, and virtue. She cultivated an image of herself, not only as a ruler, but as a model of personal rectitude, emphasizing family devotion, religious faith, and social responsibility, demonstrating through her conduct that personal character could be as influential as political power, and that the crown itself could serve as a beacon of continuity and ethical example during turbulent times. The Queen's emphasis on moral conduct and social duty resonated particularly strongly in an era marked by stark contrasts between wealth and poverty, opportunity and oppression, and she became a figure against which the virtues and vices of society could be measured, inspiring emulation while also inviting critique. As her conservative views often intersected with the debates and reforms of the day, yet it was precisely this blend of personal discipline, unwavering sense of obligation, and careful navigation of public life that allowed her to hold the monarchy together as a stabilizing force, creating a symbolic framework in which both citizens and institutions could orient themselves, trusting in the continuity of the crown, even as the world around them was transformed by industry, empire, and progress. Victoria's ability to embody stability and morality was thus inseparable from the historical moment in which she reigned. Her personal virtues became intertwined with national identity. Her long and consistent presence on the throne, given the British people a living reference point for tradition, amidst change, a touchstone of reliability, and a quiet yet powerful reassurance that the principles of family duty and ethical governance could endure even as railways, factories, and empires reshaped the landscape of human life. In this way, she was not only a queen of ceremony or law, but a symbolic guardian of values, a figure whose life and example offered continuity and confidence to a society moving at breakneck speed toward modernity. As the Victorian era unfolded beneath the steady gaze of Queen Victoria, Britain was not merely evolving, It was undergoing a transformation so profound that the very rhythms of daily life, the landscapes of cities and countryside alike, and the structures of wealth and labor were being rewritten almost overnight. For the Industrial Revolution, which had already begun to stir the nation in the preceding decades, now surged forward with full force, reshaping society and the economy in ways that were both exhilarating and terrifying, and creating a world in which the smoke-streaked skyline of Manchester or Birmingham came to symbolize human ingenuity, ambition, and the sometimes harsh realities of progress. Factories, immense and unrelenting, rose from the ground like iron and brick titans, their chimneys belching clouds of coal. Smoke that darkened the skies, while the rhythmic clatter of machinery echoed through the streets, a relentless symphony of labor that demanded both physical endurance from workers and strategic acumen from those who owned and managed these enterprises, while the hum of innovation and invention filled workshops and laboratories with the promise of a future, both dazzling and uncertain. In this era of transformation, the everyday lives of ordinary people were appended as traditional crafts and agrarian rhythms gave way to regimented schedules, dictated by factory bells, while steam engines and railways shrank distances, connecting towns and cities in ways previously unimaginable, allowing goods, ideas, and people to flow across the nation with unprecedented speed. The economy expanded at a staggering rate, creating fortunes for some while exposing stark inequalities for others. And Victoria, as monarch, observed these changes with a keen awareness that her role was not only ceremonial, but also symbolic. Her presence atop the throne lent a measure of continuity and reassurance as the social fabric strained under the weight of mechanized production, urbanization, and the influx of workers into industrial centers. Cultural life, too, felt the tremors of industrialization. New forms of literature, art, public discourse emerged to grapple with the human consequences of such sweeping change, from the crowded tenements of London to the growing middle-class neighborhoods that now bristled with manufactured comforts, gaslighting, and domestic innovations that redefined everyday existence. Victoria's reign, intersecting so vividly with this period of economic upheaval, became inseparable from the Industrial Revolution itself. This was the figurehead of a society learning to negotiate the promises and perils of modernity, embodying the tension between tradition and progress, and witnessing firsthand the paradoxes of an age in which technological brilliance and human suffering existed side by side. Through the lens of her long and meticulously chronicled reign, one can see how the Industrial Revolution not only built the foundations of modern Britain, but also forged the contours of an era defined by ambition, ingenuity, and transformation, in which the Queen's steadiness, moral guidance, and symbolic authority provided a counterbalance to the dizzying acceleration of change, allowing her subjects to navigate a world that was being reshaped as rapidly as the iron and steam that powered it, and ensuring that the monarchy remained a touchstone of continuity amid the relentless pace of industrial progress. As the smoke of industrial chimneys stretched across the British skyline and the hum of factories reverberated through towns and cities, another transformation was unfolding simultaneously, one that would extend far beyond the familiar streets of London or the factories of Manchester. For during Victoria's long and steady reign, Britain was not only reinventing itself at home, but also extending its reach across the globe, building an empire of unprecedented scale and complexity, its influence touching continents, oceans, and peoples in ways that would leave an indelible mark on world history. From the sun-baked plains of India to the fertile expanses of Africa, from the trading posts along the West African coast to the distant settlements of Australasia, Britain's territorial acquisitions reflected both ambition and the machinery of administration, military power, and commerce, all carefully overseen from the vantage point of the throne, while Victoria herself, ever mindful of her symbolic role, embodied the authority and gravitas of a monarch whose influence now spanned an entire planet, In 1877, this global reach was formalized in a ceremony of both grandeur and symbolism. When Victoria was crowned Empress of India, an event that underscored the intimate connection between the crown and the far-flung territories that made up the jewel in Britain's imperial crown. The proclamation itself was more than a title. It was a statement of Britain's presence in a world rapidly being mapped, catalogued, and ruled, and Victoria's personal fascination with India's vibrant culture. Rich textiles and intricate customs imbued the event with a sense of genuine curiosity and engagement, even as the realities of colonial administration reminded her of the weighty responsibilities that came with empire. The image of the Queen draped in ceremonial robes and regalia, standing as both Sovereign of Britain and Empress of India, became a powerful symbol of unity and authority, a living emblem of the reach and ambition of the age, linking the domestic stability of the monarchy with the vast networks of trade, governance, and culture that spanned continents. Yet this expansion was not experienced solely as an abstract political or military achievement. It shaped lives, economies, and identities across the globe, creating intricate relationships between Britain and its colonies that were at once cooperative, exploitative, and transformative. Ports hummed with commerce, railways, and telegraphs connected distant territories, and local customs were both preserved and adapted under the gaze of imperial administration. While Victoria's own engagement, though often conducted from her palaces thousands of miles away, reflected an awareness of the symbolic importance of her role as both mother of a nation and figurehead of an empire, her coronation as Empress of India was thus both personal and political, a reflection of her position at the center of a global network of power, a recognition of her symbolic authority over diverse peoples, and a reminder that the British monarchy, under her watchful eye, was now inseparable from the story of global expansion and cultural encounter. Through these developments, the Victorian era became defined not only by industrial and social change within Britain itself, but by the outward projection of British influence across the world, a projection in which Victoria's steady hand, moral authority, and enduring presence provided continuity and legitimacy, allowing an empire of such vast scope to be imagined, organized, and celebrated under the emblem of a queen whose reign had become synonymous with a world both expanding and modernizing in ways previously unimaginable, leaving a legacy of power, culture, and complexity that would resonate long after her death. While the empire expanded across continents and the smoke of industrial cities filled the air, Victoria's reign was not only a story of distant colonies and industrial marvels, but also a period of profound political transformation at home, as the foundations of British governance began to shift in ways that would alter the relationship between the monarchy, the government, and the people. And nowhere was this more evident than in the passage of a Reform Act, landmark pieces of legislation that gradually extended the right to vote to a broader segment of the population, redefining who had a voice in shaping the laws and policies of the kingdom. These reforms did not happen overnight, nor were they uncontested. They were the product of decades of agitation, debate, and social change, reflecting the pressures of an expanding urban population, the rise of a politically conscious middle class, and the growing awareness that a modern state could not thrive if it ignored the needs and aspirations of its citizens. Victoria, ever attuned to the symbolism of her position and the moral weight of her duties, observed these changes with a keen sense of the delicate balance required between tradition and progress. For while she remained personally conservative in many of her views, believing in duty, hierarchy, and the stabilizing power of institutions, she also understood that the monarchy's legitimacy depended upon its ability to adapt to evolving notions of justice, representation, and social equity. The Reform Acts, passed in stages throughout her reign, expanded suffrage. Incrementally, first 2 more men in the towns and cities, and later 2 broader segments of the working class, setting the stage. for the democratic transformations that would continue well into the 20th century. In each instance, Victoria's role was subtle but influential. She met with the ministers, provided counsel, and lent her assent at key moments, her approval signaling continuity even as the political landscape shifted beneath her feet. These reforms were more than procedural changes. They represented a profound reshaping of British society, giving new voices a place in the halls of power and challenging entrenched assumptions about who should govern and how governance should function. The streets of London and other urban centers buzzed with discussion and debate, as citizens newly empowered by the right to participate engaged with issues that had once seemed to preserve of the elite. And the monarchy, embodied in Victoria, became a stabilizing figure amid these debates, offering reassurance that change need not mean chaos and that progress could coexist with enduring national traditions. Her reign thus became a bridge between eras, linking the authority of an ancient crown with the emergent ideals of representative government and demonstrating that even a monarch who valued duty, morality, and family could navigate the currents of political reform without losing the respect of her people or the dignity of her office. Through this delicate interplay between authority and adaptation, Victoria's influence helped shape the trajectory of modern Britain, showing that the monarchy remained relevant and respected even as the democratic foundations of the nation expanded, and leaving a legacy in which the stability of tradition and the necessity of reform were harmonized in a way that would guide the country long after her reign came to an end. As the political landscape shifted and Britain navigated the accelerating currents of industrialization, urbanization, and expanding democracy, the monarchy itself faced a quiet but profound imperative: to remain relevant and respected in the eyes of a populace whose expectations were evolving with each generation. And it was within this context that Victoria, guided by instinct, personal convictions, and the enduring influence of Albert's counsel, even after his death, began to emphasize the power of family values and moral example as the very pillars upon which the modern monarchy could rest. In the public eye, the Queen was more than a distant figurehead. She became a living embodiment of ideals that resonated with her subjects, demonstrating through her own conduct the virtues of devotion, responsibility, temperance, and compassion, while subtly modeling behaviors that would ripple outward, shaping not only how citizens viewed their sovereign, but also how society understood the interplay between personal integrity and public duty. Victoria's own household became a microcosm of this philosophy, where the routines of family life, meal times, education, religious observance, and the careful cultivation of relationships among her 9 children were conducted with an attention to discipline, empathy, and ceremony that conveyed both love and expectation, illustrating that the crown could be a moral compass as well as a seat of authority. The royal family, through its public appearances, private correspondences, and carefully curated narratives, exemplified cohesion, loyalty, and the cultivation of virtue, offering a model for society at large to emulate, even as the complexities of industrial cities and the political empowerment of new social classes created pressures that demanded adaptability, empathy, and foresight. In this way, Victoria's personal example extended far beyond palace walls. For every act of conscientious parenting, every charitable engagement, every public demonstration of moral steadiness reinforced the perception of the monarchy as a stabilizing force in a world increasingly characterized by flux and uncertainty. The emphasis on moral example also allowed Victoria to assert influence subtly yet profoundly, shaping cultural norms and social expectations without the need for legislative action. Her choices in dress, demeanor, philanthropy, and ritual signaling to the public the virtues she prized: piety, temperance, self-discipline, and familial loyalty. Through this careful orchestration, the monarchy adapted to changing times, not by resisting innovation or social evolution, but by integrating these changes into a framework of continuity, using the Queen's conduct and the visible harmony of her family as both guideposts and symbols of enduring national identity. Thus, the Victorian monarchy evolved into an institution that bridged past and present, melding the grandeur and authority of centuries-old tradition with a tangible human example that resonated across class lines, conveying that leadership was not only a matter of policy or ceremony, but also of character and moral guidance. In cultivating these family values and projecting moral example, Victoria ensured that the monarchy remained a touchstone of stability and propriety, a living narrative through which citizens could negotiate the complexities of modern life, drawing inspiration from a sovereign whose personal life and public conduct were inextricably intertwined, and whose influence on the ethical and cultural fabric of Britain would endure long after her reign had ended. Even as Victoria cultivated the image of a morally grounded family monarch and symbol of national stability, she understood that the effective exercise of her role required more than personal virtue. It demanded a careful engagement with the minds and strategies of those who shaped the machinery of government. And it was within this intricate interplay between crown and cabinet that she forged some of the most consequential relationships of her reign, most notably with prime ministers such as Lord Melbourne and Benjamin Disraeli, whose personalities, philosophies, and political acumen left lasting impressions on her understanding of governance, diplomacy, and the subtleties of statecraft. These relationships were never purely ceremonial. Victoria approached them with the same attentiveness and seriousness that characterized her approach to family and public duty, recognizing that a monarch who sought both relevance and influence in a constitutional framework needed not only to observe, but also to listen, to advise discreetly, and to assert authority when necessary, all while maintaining the delicate balance between personal judgment and political neutrality that defined the evolving role of the British sovereign. Her early years as queen were closely shaped by the guidance of Lord Melbourne, a prime minister whose calm demeanor, wit, and steady counsel provided Victoria with a kind of tutelage in the practicalities of government, allowing her to gain confidence in her ability to influence policy, manage ministers, and navigate the labyrinthine procedures of constitutional monarchy without overstepping the boundaries that history and convention demanded. Melbourne's mentorship extended beyond political instruction. He became a confidant in whom the young queen could confide her uncertainties and ambitions. And through their interactions, Victoria learned the subtle art of persuasion, the importance of timing, and the ways in which personal rapport could shape the course of decisions that affected millions. This foundational relationship instilled in her both a respect for the office of Prime Minister and an understanding that effective leadership required collaboration as much as authority. Decades later, her rapport with Benjamin Disraeli demonstrated the enduring significance of such personal connections in shaping political outcomes and public perception. Disraeli, a master of rhetoric, strategy, and symbolism, complemented Victoria's own keen sense of image and ceremony, and together they navigated the complexities of imperial policy, social reform, and parliamentary maneuvering with a synergy that elevated both their standings. He as a celebrated statesman, she as a sovereign whose approval carried immense weight. Victoria's interactions with Disraeli were characterized by mutual admiration and strategic acumen, and in private correspondences, public ceremonies, in moments of personal counsel, their relationship exemplified the unique capacity of the monarchy to influence governance, not through legislation, but through the subtle power of guidance, persuasion, and symbolic authority. Through these enduring relationships with prime ministers, Victoria demonstrated a nuanced understanding of constitutional monarchy. She could be both observant and engaged, discreet yet influential, a sovereign who shaped policy through intellect, judgment, and personal diplomacy rather than direct command. In doing so, she reinforced the monarchy's relevance in a rapidly changing society, proving that even amidst industrial upheaval, political reform, and imperial expansion, the crown could remain a guiding force, stabilizing presence, and a conduit of continuity, all while respecting the evolving mechanisms of democratic governance that defined her era. Yet, even as Victoria cultivated productive and respectful relationships with certain prime ministers, it was inevitable that the crown's exercise of influence would encounter friction, for the nature of constitutional monarchy demanded both deference and engagement, and no two personalities could perfectly align. One of the most notable examples of such tension occurred with William Gladstone, a towering figure of liberal politics whose intellect, moral rigor, reformist zeal often placed him at odds with the Queen's conservative instincts and her deeply ingrained sense of duty, propriety, and continuity. From the outset, their interactions were marked by a subtle but unmistakable undercurrent of disagreement, as Gladstone's vision for expanding the electorate, challenging traditional hierarchies, and implementing sweeping social reforms sometimes clashed with Victoria's belief in measured progress, the stabilizing power of established institutions, and the importance of moral example as a guiding force in public life. Victoria approached these clashes with a blend of firmness and tact, recognizing that open confrontation could destabilize both the perception and function of the monarchy. And yet she did not hesitate to assert her perspective when she believed that the long-term welfare of the nation or the dignity of the crown was at stake. Letters, private audiences, and carefully considered interventions became her tools, allowing her to voice concerns, influence appointments, and shape policy debates without overtly breaching the boundaries of constitutional propriety. And in this delicate dance, both the Queen and Gladstone navigated a complex web of respect, principle, and political necessity, with each occasionally pressing the other to reconsider assumptions while never entirely surrendering their own convictions. These clashes were more than personal disagreements. They were emblematic of the evolving dynamics between monarchy and parliament, highlighting the tensions inherent in a system where a sovereign's moral authority and symbolic influence could intersect with the pragmatic, often partisan, ambitions of elected leaders. Victoria's engagement with Gladstone demonstrated her acute awareness of the weight of tradition, the significance of public perception, and the need to maintain a consistent moral stance, even in the face of policies she might quietly oppose. She understood that her influence lay not in direct legislation, but in the subtle shaping of the political environment through counsel, persuasion, and the careful exercise of ceremonial authority. And in this, interactions with Gladstone became a masterclass in the art of balance, upholding the dignity and relevance of the monarchy while respecting the emergent principles of representative government that defined her age. Through these episodes of friction and negotiation, Victoria's reign revealed the complexities of constitutional power, showing that leadership often involves navigating disagreement with intellect, patience, and an unwavering sense of purpose, and that, even amidst discord, a sovereign could exert meaningful influence, safeguard the continuity of institutions, and help steer the moral and political compass of a nation, all while embodying the stability and ethical example that had become the hallmark of her extraordinary time on the throne. Although Victoria's constitutional authority was constrained by the evolving structures of parliamentary democracy, her influence over British politics was far from negligible, for she possessed a keen understanding that power often flowed not solely from formal decrees or legislative control, but through the subtler channels of personal relationships, carefully crafted correspondence, and the cultivation of trust, loyalty, and respect among those who wielded direct authority. Every letter she wrote to her prime ministers, every private audience she granted, and every conversation held behind closed doors became an instrument through which she could articulate her views, advocate for policies she believed were prudent, and shape the perspectives of those responsible for governing a rapidly changing nation, all without overstepping the constitutional boundaries that defined her role as a monarch in an age of increasing democratic participation. Victoria's correspondence, in particular, was a window into the sophisticated methods by which she exerted influence, blending keen observation, moral reasoning, and persuasive argumentation with the intimacy of personal advice and guidance. She wrote two figures, such as Lord Melbourne, Benjamin Disraeli, and even William Gladstone, with an awareness of their temperaments, strengths, and ambitions, tailoring her tone and arguments to resonate with each recipient. Offering counsel that was at once principled and politically astute, while always mindful of the need to preserve the dignity of her office and the trust of her subjects. These letters often went beyond mere discussion of policy. They conveyed the Queen's ethical framework, her deep commitment to national stability, and her understanding of the broader social, economic, and international contexts in which Britain operated, effectively shaping decisions without ever issuing commands. Moreover, Victoria recognized that influence was relational and cumulative, cultivating long-term relationships with ministers, diplomats, and advisors allowed her to act as a stabilizing force within the often turbulent currents of politics, providing guidance that could temper rash decisions, reinforce strategic thinking, or remind leaders of the enduring responsibilities of governance. Through these personal channels, she could promote continuity, safeguard institutional integrity, and subtly steer the course of legislation and imperial policy in directions aligned with her convictions, demonstrating that even a sovereign whose formal powers were circumscribed could wield extraordinary soft power, leaving an imprint on the machinery of government that extended well beyond ceremonial appearances. In essence, Victoria's reign exemplified the profound ways in which influence can be exercised without overt authority, through thoughtfulness, persuasion, and the careful balancing of relationships. She shaped the course of political life in Britain, reminding her ministers and advisors alike that the crown, while limited in legal power, remained a vital, moral, and strategic force, capable of guiding a nation through periods of rapid change, industrial expansion, and imperial ambition, all while maintaining the respect, loyalty, and admiration of those who governed on her behalf. Even as Victoria exercised subtle influence through correspondence and personal relationships, the public and political perception of her character was never monolithic. For throughout her long reign, she was both venerated and scrutinized, lauded for her steadfast devotion to duty, moral rectitude, and the stability she provided during times of immense change. And yet, at the same time, she faced criticism from those who interpreted her unwavering principles, deeply felt emotions, and intense personal convictions as signs of stubbornness or excessive sentimentality, a duality that reflected not only the complexity of her personality, but also the broader tensions inherent in a figure whose life was lived simultaneously in the intensely private sphere of family and grief, in the unrelenting public gaze of an empire. Victoria's devotion to Albert, her insistence on family cohesion, and her moral rigor often drew admiration from those who saw in her a model of constancy and integrity, qualities that lent the monarchy a sense of gravitas and authority, even as society around it evolved rapidly. Yet the very same qualities that inspired loyalty and reverence could, in the eyes of critics, appear as obstinacy. Her reluctance to embrace certain political reforms, wholeheartedly her emotional responses to personal loss, and her insistence on propriety and ritual sometimes led contemporaries to describe her as inflexible, overly sentimental, or resistant to modern ideas, particularly in an era that increasingly valued pragmatism, efficiency, and public accountability. These perceptions were amplified by the intensity with which she lived her life, for every gesture, letter, or public appearance was scrutinized for hints of character and intent, and the duality of admiration and critique became a recurring theme, shaping how her reign was remembered both by those who lived through it and by subsequent generations of historians. What made this dynamic particularly striking was how Victoria navigated it, blending personal conviction with awareness of public opinion, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding that perception could be as influential as policy, and that maintaining authority required more than simply wielding power. It required cultivating respect, managing expectations, and embodying ideals that transcended mere political expediency. Even when she was labeled stubborn or overly emotional, she harnessed these traits in ways that reinforced her symbolic authority, presenting a sovereign who was fully human, yet elevated by her commitment to duty, family, and the moral and cultural framework she sought to project. In this light, Victoria's reputation as both revered and criticized serves as a testament to the complex interplay between personal character and public perception, illustrating that leadership, especially in a constitutional monarchy, is rarely judged solely by decisions or actions, by the consistent projection of values, the courage to uphold convictions in the face of scrutiny, that capacity to balance emotion with reason. All of which Victoria managed with remarkable skill throughout her extraordinary 70-year-long life in the public eye, as Victoria navigated the intricate responsibilities of monarchy. The world around her was undergoing transformations so profound that they reshaped not only the physical landscape of Britain, but also the very way its citizens experienced time, space, and connection. For the Victorian era was a period defined by an unprecedented wave of technological innovation, each breakthrough cascading into society with consequences both practical and symbolic. And nowhere was this more evident than in the advent of railways, photography, and the telegraph. Inventions that seemed almost magical to those who had grown up in an age when journeys took days. Images could only be imagined, and news traveled no faster than the swiftest horse or ship. The iron arteries of the railways stretched across the nation like veins carrying the lifeblood of commerce, culture, and communication, shrinking distances between cities, towns, and countryside, and allowing people, ideas, and goods to flow with a speed previously unimaginable. Victoria herself witnessed the transformation of travel firsthand, attending grand openings, reviewing railway expansions, and marveling at the possibilities for connecting her sprawling empire, where the reach of the crown could now, in principle, be felt in ways that were both symbolic and tangible, knitting together communities that had once seemed isolated by geography and time. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on iron tracks, the hissing of steam engines, and the sculpted ironwork of stations became emblematic of progress itself, a tangible manifestation of an era that bore her name and that would define the rhythms of daily life for millions. Photography, meanwhile, transformed the way people remembered, understood, and projected themselves, turning fleeting moments into enduring images and providing Victoria with the ability to both record and communicate her reign in ways that predecessors could scarcely imagine. Portraits captured not only the likenesses of royalty and subjects, but also the details of fashion, domestic spaces, and ceremonial occasions. While the Queen's engagement with the medium symbolized a willingness to embrace innovation that complemented her emphasis on moral and cultural leadership, demonstrating that even in a period steeped in tradition, modern tools could enhance the monarchy's connection to its people. And then there was the telegraph, a marvel of instantaneous communication that seemed almost otherworldly, sending dots and dashes across continents and oceans, linking ministers, colonial administrators, and military officials in real time, and allowing Victoria to maintain a sense of oversight over an empire that spanned time zones and hemispheres, creating an intricate web of information and control that previously could only exist in imagination. The ability to exchange urgent messages, coordinate policy, and receive updates from distant corners of the globe reshaped her perception of governance and underscored the profound ways in which technological innovation could amplify both power and responsibility. Taken together, these advanced scissor waves photography and the telegraph, more than speed travel or send images and messages, fundamentally altered the rhythm of life, the experience of authority, and the ways in which monarch could engage with subjects, ministers, in an ever-expanding empire, situating Victoria not merely as a witness to progress, but as a sovereign whose reign both facilitated and symbolically embodied the transformative energies of her age, and whose ability to navigate these changes with curiosity, prudence, and adaptability reinforced her enduring relevance. In an era defined by both innovation and upheaval, as the machinery of communication and reproduction advanced alongside the railways, photography, and telegraph, Victoria's own image became a powerful instrument in shaping the perception of monarchy and consolidating her role as a unifying national figurehead. For in an age when literacy was growing but still limited for many, visual representations carried an extraordinary weight, and the proliferation of her portraits, engravings, and photographs ensured that the Queen's presence could be felt in parlors, schools, and public halls across Britain and beyond, imbuing the abstract institution of monarchy with a tangible, relatable, and emotionally resonant human face. Each carefully composed portrait, whether in the solemnity of state regalia, the intimacy of family settings, or the elegance of ceremonial occasions, was more than mere likeness. It was a deliberate projection of character, virtue, and authority, reflecting the Queen's unwavering attention to the moral and symbolic dimensions of her reign, and reinforcing the values she embodied: dignity, steadfastness, familial devotion, and a sense of continuity amidst a rapidly evolving society. The circulation of Victoria's image was further amplified by advances in printing, engraving, and, later, photography, creating a visual ubiquity that allowed her to inhabit both the private imagination and public consciousness of her subjects. Simultaneously, and in doing so, she became not just a ruler, observed from a distance, but a living emblem of national identity, whose visage conveyed reassurance, authority, and stability in an era marked by social, industrial, and political upheaval. Schools displayed her likeness to inspire loyalty and moral reflection. Newspapers and magazines reproduced her images to accompany accounts of royal duties and charitable endeavors. And households across the empire possessed miniatures and photographs that made the Queen's presence a constant, quiet companion in daily life, linking the personal sphere with the symbolic weight of the crown. Through these reproductions, Victoria's role extended far beyond the ceremonial confines of palaces or the formal proceedings of Parliament. She became an omnipresent emblem of continuity and unity, her carefully curated image bridging the gap between monarchy and populace, between tradition and modernity, and between the intimate world of personal virtue and the public stage of national leadership. In this way, the visual dissemination of her likeness was not merely aesthetic, but profoundly political and cultural, reinforcing her symbolic authority, shaping public sentiment, and demonstrating that even in an age of unprecedented technological change, the power of image, fused with intention, morality, and careful presentation, could serve as a cornerstone of influence, solidifying her status as a figure whose presence, though mediated by medium and technology, resonated with the collective imagination of a nation and an empire at the height of its reach. As the decades of Victoria's reign unfolded, her influence extended far beyond the shores of Britain. Not only through the subtle exercise of political judgment and the symbolic weight of her image, but also through the intricate web of family alliances she carefully nurtured. For the marriages of her 9 children into royal families across the European continent transformed her from a national monarch into a figure of continental significance, earning her the enduring epithet of the Grandmother of Europe, a title that reflected not mere sentimentality, but a profound reshaping of dynastic politics, where personal relationships and familial strategy intertwined with the currents of diplomacy, alliance, and power in ways that affected entire nations. Each marriage was more than a union of 2 individuals, but was a carefully considered act with implications for the balance of influence across courts in Germany, Russia, Greece, and beyond, creating networks of loyalty and obligation that linked monarchies through blood as much as through treaties. And in this sprawling familial tapestry, Victoria exerted her guidance with the same meticulous attention she applied to her duties as queen. corresponding constantly with her children, advising on etiquette, political sensitivities, and the delicate interplay between personal happiness and dynastic responsibility. Understanding that the choices made within her own family could ripple outward, shaping perceptions, alliances, and even international relations in subtle but enduring ways. Victoria's role as the matriarch of Europe was thus a unique form of soft power, one exercised not through armies or legislation, but through counsel, moral authority, and the cultivation of enduring familial loyalty. For her children carried not only her genes, but also her sense of duty, propriety, and moral example into their new courts, often acting as extensions of her influence, whether in matters of protocol, charitable initiatives, or public representation. Her correspondences reveal a woman deeply invested in the well-being and conduct of her offspring, guiding them through complex political landscapes with a combination of affectionate concern and imperious clarity, demonstrating that even as the Victorian era advanced technologically, industrially, and politically, the age-old mechanisms of dynastic influence remained potent instruments in shaping the course of nations. Through this sprawling network of children, grandchildren, and royal in-laws, Victoria's presence permeated the continent, connecting disparate courts into a web of kinship that carried her moral and cultural imprint far beyond the British Isles. And in doing so, she embodied a form of familial diplomacy that complemented her public authority, reinforced her symbolic role as a stabilizing figure, and cemented her legacy as a monarch whose reach was simultaneously domestic, imperial, and profoundly European, making the title Grandmother of Europe not merely a flattering epithet, but a reflection of the tangible, strategic, and human impact she exerted across generations and borders. The remarkable reach of Victoria's family extended far beyond the boundaries of the British Isles. For, through her children and grandchildren, she became intricately entwined with the governance and destiny of much of Europe, her bloodline weaving itself into the thrones of Germany, Russia, Spain, Greece, and numerous other kingdoms, creating a living network of influence that spanned cultures, languages, and political systems, in which, in many ways, mirrored the global expanse of the British Empire over which she reigned. Each descendant who assumed a crown or a prominent position carried not only the weight of local responsibility, but also the subtle imprint of Victoria's values, upbringing, and sense of duty. For she had imbued her children with a rigorous understanding of etiquette, moral conduct, and the symbolic importance of monarchy, teaching them that their personal behavior, public appearance, in diplomatic interactions, could have far-reaching consequences, affecting perceptions of both their own courts and the broader network of royal alliances to which they now belonged. From her eldest daughter, Victoria, who became Crown Princess of Prussia and later Empress of Germany, to her son Edward VII, whose reign would shape the British monarchy at the dawn of the 20th century, to her other children strategically placed in kingdoms across the continent. Each placement reflected both familial affection and deliberate political calculation, ensuring that her lineage was not only a personal legacy, but a web of dynastic connections that intertwined the fates of nations. Her influence, often exercised through letters, advice, and careful observation, ensured that even as her grandchildren ascended foreign thrones, the moral and cultural principles she cherished traveled with them, subtly guiding decisions, shaping courtly behavior, and reinforcing the image of a monarch whose reach, though indirect, could subtly steer the course of international relations. This sprawling family network transformed Victoria's domestic role into a continental phenomenon, positioning her as a central figure in European affairs without ever directly wielding military or legislative power, and underscoring the unique ways in which monarchy functioned, not only through formal institutions, but through kinship, counsel, and the transmission of values across generations, through marriages, alliances, and the careful nurturing of relationships. Victoria's descendants became rulers and consorts, advisors and influencers, all carrying fragments of her legacy into their respective realms, making her presence felt not merely as a sovereign of Britain, but as a matriarch whose guidance, reputation, and familial strategies resonated across Europe in flux, binding nations together in a web of bloodlines that would shape diplomacy, succession, and international perception for decades to come, and leaving an indelible mark on the political and cultural map of the continent that continues to be traced in historical memory. As the decades of Victoria's reign stretched into their sixth and seventh, the British public found ever more ways to express both admiration and affection for their long-serving monarch, culminating in the grand, unforgettable spectacles of her Golden Jubilee in 1887 and her Diamond Jubilee in 1897. Events that were not merely ceremonies of pomp and pageantry, but powerful affirmations of national identity, unity, and continuity, carefully orchestrated to celebrate not only the endurance of her reign, but the symbolic stability she represented. In an era of rapid industrial, social, and imperial change, streets were festooned with banners, flags, and garlands, while towns and villages from London to the farthest reaches of the empire joined in processions, feasts, and concerts, creating a tangible, almost electric sense of collective participation in an achievement that seemed both monumental and intimate. For in celebrating the Queen, subjects were simultaneously celebrating the moral and cultural fabric of their society and the reassuring presence of a figure whose life had intertwined so thoroughly with the story of their nation. During the Golden Jubilee, Victoria was honored for 50 years on the throne, a milestone that underscored not only the longevity of her personal reign, but also the remarkable transformations she had overseen, from industrial expansion and technological innovation to the consolidation of the British Empire and the evolution of parliamentary democracy. Her presence at the ceremonies, often composed yet imbued with the warmth of personal connection, was met with widespread adoration. The cheers of crowds mingling with the music, the striking of bells, and the rhythmic march of troops, all creating a symphony of national pride that resonated far beyond the ceremonial grounds. These celebrations were not superficial displays. They functioned as a vivid reminder of the Queen's ongoing relevance, bridging the private virtues of her character's steadfastness, family devotion, moral rectitude with the public imagination, reinforcing her role as a stabilizing, guiding force whose symbolic authority carried profound emotional weight. A decade later, the Diamond Jubilee marked 60 years on the throne, a feat of extraordinary endurance that few sovereigns in history have achieved, and the scale of the celebrations reflected the global reach of Victoria's influence, with representatives of the far-flung corners of the empire, colonial administrators, and loyal subjects participating in a carefully choreographed sequence of processions, military displays, and ceremonial events that showcased both imperial power and national cohesion. Here, too, Victoria's image was central. Her careful attire, poised demeanor, and visible engagement with her subjects reinforced her enduring popularity and the moral authority she projected, while newspapers, engravings, and emerging photographic technologies captured the moment for posterity, ensuring that her symbolic presence extended beyond those who witnessed the celebrations firsthand. In these jubilees, the Queen's personal story, her trials, griefs, coups, and triumphs merged seamlessly with the narrative of the nation, transforming public festivity into a ritualized acknowledgement of continuity, loyalty, and shared identity, while simultaneously reaffirming her popularity as a monarch who had become synonymous with the very era she helped define, reminding all who witnessed or learned of the events that the Queen was not merely a distant sovereign, but a living emblem of resilience, stability, and the enduring values that held the social, political, and imperial fabric together across generations and continents. As the sun of the 19th century began to dip toward its western horizon, casting long, golden shadows over the palaces, towns, and cities that had flourished under her reign, Queen Victoria emerged not merely as a historical figurehead, but as an architect of the very institution she embodied. for she understood with remarkable clarity that the survival and relevance of the British monarchy depended not solely on the weight of centuries-old tradition, nor on rigid adherence to ceremonial forms, but on a careful, deliberate balance between continuity and adaptability, a balance that allowed her to honor the venerable customs of the crown while embracing the subtle shifts demanded by a rapidly changing society, industrializing economy, and an empire. Its global reach required unprecedented attention to both symbolism and practical governance. Victoria's genius lay in her ability to navigate the often turbulent waters of public expectation, political evolution, and familial responsibility, shaping a modern monarchy that could retain its mystique, moral authority, and ceremonial grandeur, even as the mechanisms of governance, communication, and empire transformed around her. She meticulously curated the public persona of the crown, projecting dignity, stability, and moral rectitude, while also permitting herself and her family to engage in personal and domestic practices that humanized her rule, from introducing and popularizing family-centered traditions such as the Christmas tree to participating in public charity, correspondence, and carefully managed appearances that connected her to the people she reigned over without undermining the aura of sovereign authority that was essential to monarchy. At the same time, Victoria's adaptability was evident in her political acumen. As she cultivated relationships with prime ministers, advised her children in dynastic and diplomatic matters, and maintained correspondence that subtly influenced the direction of policy without overstepping the bounds of constitutional monarchy, demonstrating that influence could be exercised with nuance, moral authority, and strategic timing rather than raw power, and thereby setting a template for future sovereigns to maintain relevance in an age when direct political control had waned, but symbolic, cultural, and moral leadership had never been more crucial. Through this delicate dance between tradition and innovation, Victoria reshaped expectations of what a monarch could be, a figure who embodied the enduring values of national identity, moral guidance, and ceremonial grandeur, while simultaneously engaging with the modern realities of empire, industrial society, and international diplomacy, creating a model of monarchy that was resilient, responsive, and deeply personal, whose influence extended far beyond legislation, armies, or pomp into the everyday consciousness of her subjects and across the generations that would follow, leaving a legacy in which the crown was not merely inherited, but continually redefined to meet the needs, challenges, and aspirations of a modern nation. As the final years of Queen Victoria's extraordinary life unfolded, and the shadows of the Victorian era began to lengthen across the British Isles and far-flung corners of the empire, it became increasingly clear that her reign was not simply a chronological marker in history, but a profound force that shaped the very contours of modern Britain and the wider world, leaving behind a legacy as intricate and enduring as the vast networks of railways, telegraph lines, and imperial trade routes that now connected continents in ways unimaginable when she first ascended the throne. Her influence extended across realms of governance, society, culture, and family, intertwining the symbolic authority of monarchy with the tangible developments in political reform, industrial advancement, and social consciousness. Throughout her 63-year reign, Victoria oversaw the expansion of the British Empire to unprecedented scales, with colonial holdings stretching across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, establishing not just geopolitical dominance, but also cultural and economic networks that facilitated the exchange of ideas, comedies, and traditions across vast distances, imprinting the British presence on countless local societies, while simultaneously introducing foreign influences into Britain itself, from the colorful textiles and spices of India to the political philosophies and innovations emerging from continental Europe, creating a dynamic interplay between imperial reach and domestic transformation that reflected her unique role as both sovereign and cultural mediator. At the same time, Hara was one of intense political evolution. The Reform Acts gradually expanded suffrage. Parliamentary influence grew, and the monarchy's role transformed into a constitutional and symbolic authority whose moral and ceremonial weight often guided national sentiment, even without direct legislative power. Victoria's careful cultivation of relationships with prime ministers, her keen attention to public perception, and her moral example helped stabilize these political transitions, demonstrating that the crown could adapt to new realities without losing its foundational gravitas. Cultural life likewise flourished under her auspices, with literature, art, science, and architecture experiencing unprecedented growth, while traditions, customs from family-centered Christmas celebrations to charitable patronage became enduring markers of national identity, many of which trace their origins to initiatives and personal preferences championed by the Queen herself. Ultimately, the legacy of Queen Victoria was not confined to statistics or events alone, nor to the visible infrastructure of empire or industrialization. It lived in the ways her reign shaped minds, values, and institutions, acute in the moral tone and cultural sensibilities that carried forward into the 20th century, and in the complex web of family alliances that cemented her influence across Europe, ensuring that even after her passing, the echoes of her life, decisions, and personality continued to reverberate across nations, societies, and generations. Her reign stands as a testament to the transformative power of vision, endurance, and personal engagement in the life of a nation, illustrating how one monarch, through a combination of symbolic presence, careful adaptation, and strategic influence, could leave an indelible mark upon the political, cultural, and imperial landscape of her time, creating a chapter in history whose effects continue to shape our understanding of monarchy, governance, and societal development to this day. As the dawn of the 20th century approached, the once vivid halls of Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace seemed to carry a quieter, more reflective air, tinged with the weight of decades and the accumulated memories of a life that had become inseparable from the story of an empire for Queen Victoria, who had reigned with steadfast dedication for more than 6 decades. Now faced the final chapters of her extraordinary journey, her presence increasingly measured, her movements deliberate, and her thoughts often turning to the sweeping transformations, triumphs, and trials that had defined her reign. The crown, which she had worn with a combination of duty, dignity, and personal devotion, would soon pass to the next generation, signaling not just a dynastic succession, but the symbolic conclusion of an era that had shaped Britain and the wider world in ways both tangible and immeasurable. In the months leading up to her death in 1901, Victoria's health gradually declined. In the household that had long been a center of ceremony governance, an intimate family life grew quiet with anticipation and solemnity as courtiers, family members, and servants alike sensed that a chapter of unparalleled historical significance was drawing to a close. Her final days were spent surrounded by the familiar comforts and reminders of a life lived in devoted service. Portraits and mementos of her beloved Albert, letters and keepsakes from her children and grandchildren, and the ever-present trappings of monarchy that had come to symbolize stability, moral guidance, and the continuity of tradition amidst a century of rapid change. Yet, despite the physical decline, the indomitable spirit that had characterized her reign, the meticulous attention to detail, the unwavering sense of duty, and the enduring empathy toward both family and subjects remained quietly present, an invisible thread connecting the long years of her rule to the new century on the horizon. When Victoria finally passed away, the news reverberated across the empire and beyond, eliciting grief and reflection not only among her immediate family, but across nations that had been touched, directly or indirectly, by her reign. The ceremonial mourning, the solemn funeral processions, and the public demonstrations of respect and sorrow all underscored the magnitude of her influence and the sense of collective loss experienced by millions who had grown up under the shadow and guidance of a monarch whose life had become a symbol of continuity, duty, and moral steadfastness. In death, as in life, Victoria embodied an epoch. Her passing, marking the definitive end of the Victorian era period, characterized by industrial transformation, imperial expansion, political evolution, and cultural flourishing, while simultaneously passing the crown to her son, Edward VII, who would inherit not only the title, but the weighty mantle of guiding the monarchy into a new century. Tasked with preserving the legacy of his mother while adapting to a rapidly changing world whose contours she had, in so many ways, helped define. The death of Queen Victoria thus represented more than the loss of a sovereign. It signified the conclusion of an age, a pivot between centuries, and a moment of profound historical reflection. As the world paused to reckon with the extraordinary life of a woman whose personal devotion, moral authority, and careful balancing of tradition and adaptation had left an indelible mark on her nation, her empire, and the broader European stage, creating a legacy whose reverberations would continue to shape politics, culture, and society long after the last notes of mourning had faded and a new monarch assumed the throne. As we reach the final chapter of Queen Victoria's remarkable life and reign, it becomes clear that her story is not simply one of chronological events, dates, or ceremonial milestones, but rather a sweeping narrative that reflects the evolution of an entire nation, the expansion of an empire, and the transformation of culture, society, and politics across an era that now bears her name. Ascending the throne in 1837 at the tender age of 18, following the death of her uncle, King William. For Victoria inherited not only a crown, but a complex legacy of expectations, traditions, and responsibilities thrust suddenly into a role that would define her life and in turn shape the destiny of Britain for decades to come. Her youth did not diminish her capacity for diligence or vision. From the outset, she approached her role with a combination of energy, moral conviction, and the instinctive understanding that the monarchy needed to reflect both continuity and adaptability. In a time of rapid industrial, social, and political change, her marriage in 1842, her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, marked the beginning of a partnership that would profoundly influence her personal life, her approach to governance, and the broader cultural life of Britain. Their deep affection for one another transcended mere formality, providing Victoria with a trusted advisor, confidant, and companion whose intelligence, judgment, and progressive sensibilities complemented her own steadfastness and dedication to duty. Together, they nurtured a family of 9 children, each of whom would marry into European royal houses, earning Victoria the enduring title of the Grandmother of Europe and intertwining the British monarchy with a continent's dynastic networks, a web of influence that extended her reach far beyond the British Isles. Albert's presence in court and council in state matters helped shape not only domestic cultural developments, but also the careful navigation of political challenges, allowing Victoria to exercise influence in ways that respected constitutional limits, while still leaving a tangible imprint on governance, public morality, and national identity. The sudden death of Albert in 1861 plunged Victoria into profound grief, a sorrow that manifested in her lifelong commitment to mourning attire, the black clothing that became her enduring emblem of personal loss in a period of public withdrawal that stunned both court and country. For years, she receded from the public eye, yet even in seclusion, her symbolic authority remained potent, and over time, Victoria gradually returned to her duties with a renewed sense of purpose, demonstrating an extraordinary resilience that would allow her to remain a stabilizing force during an age of extraordinary change. As Britain confronted the sweeping transformations of the Industrial Revolution, the expansion of the railways, the invention of the telegraph, and the growth of factories and urban centers, Victoria's monarchy became a reassuring symbol of stability and moral authority, anchoring the nation amid technological upheaval and social reorganization. The Victorian era was also a time of imperial ambition and consolidation, culminating in Victoria's crowning as Empress of India in 1877. an event that highlighted Britain's global reach and underscored her personal connection to the empire. Meanwhile, domestic politics continued to evolve, with the passage of the Reform Acts expanding the electorate and shaping gauge on parliamentary governance in ways that would resonate for generations. Though the monarchy's formal powers were limited, Victoria exercised subtle yet significant influence through her personal relationships with prime ministers, notably Lord Melbourne and Benjamin Disraeli, while often clashing with William Gladstone, reflecting both her tenacity and the complexity of her political engagements. Her interventions, correspondence, and counsel exemplified how a sovereign could leave an indelible mark without overstepping constitutional boundaries, demonstrating the power of persuasion, moral authority, and strategic engagement. Victoria's life was also marked by contradictions and human complexity. She was widely revered, yet often criticized, seen by some as stubborn or overly emotional. Yet her enduring legacy reflects a careful balancing of personal conviction, public responsibility, and moral guidance. Technological innovations such as photography, the telegraph, and railways transformed society and communication, while her widely reproduced image strengthened her role as a unifying figure and national emblem. She oversaw public celebrations like her Golden Jubilee in 1887 and Diamond Jubilee in 1897, which reinforced her popularity and highlighted the enduring affection of her subjects, while her personal influence on family morality and tradition helped shape a modern monarchy capable of maintaining relevance and authority in a rapidly changing world. By the time of her death in 1901, Queen Victoria had left a legacy that spanned empire, culture, and politics, reflecting both the challenges and achievements of a life dedicated to service, family, and country. The crown passed to her son, Edward VII, signaling the end of an era and the beginning of a new chapter in British history. Yet the imprint of her life, her values, and her vision endured, echoing through the institutions, traditions, and international relationships she had nurtured with care and foresight. Her reign reminds us of the extraordinary power of resilience, moral guidance, and measured adaptability in leadership, and the profound impact one life can have on generations, nations, and continents alike. So, as we close the pages of Queen Victoria's story tonight, let us reflect on the remarkable sweep of her life, the transformations she witnessed, and the enduring legacy she left behind, a reminder of how history is shaped not only by events, but by the people who lived them with vision, courage, and devotion. Good night, and may your dreams carry you through the grand corridors of history. Echoing the life and legacy of one of the most extraordinary monarchs the world has ever known.